that came from people who are associated with Red Hat or with Fedora.
Yeah.
One of the things so one of the things that I would usually try and tell people is, if you want to work on a distribution which works upstream, Fedora is one of the better options to stick with. I personally use Fedora to do my work, to do my programming mostly. But what I did find is, even though lots of people will help you out with when you have issues, and people do pay attention to the Fedora faults, I do tend to have some issues with packages not being totally compatible. That's one of the issues I had. Do you know of any work perhaps that Fedora is doing to improve the situation with regards to such issues? Because I know I'm not the only person who had this type of issue. I spoke to some friends who are also using Fedora, and they had those kind of small things, all kinds of small creases and things where an application that's you'd expect to work just fine with Fedora would not exactly work, and I don't think that's the fault of Fedora, but this is perhaps to do with the level of testing or the level of maturity in the number of users who in fact provide feedback to tell them, well, this package here doesn't use compatible versions of something. In my case, I had things like ImageMagick not being compatible with GNU Octave, and they wouldn't, every attempt to do a plot of something wouldn't quite work if I did try certain things. And that was a major issue. It took me many hours to try and resolve. And this is one of those areas I usually think this is why people feel a bit afraid of trying Fedora. Do you know of any work Fedora 15 is doing in that regard, trying to address this area? I'm not saying it's an issue. I'm just saying in my case and in the case of some other people, the problem did exist.
I wouldn't say it's being addressed specifically in Fedora 14. I would say it's being addressed generally for all of their distributions. It's something they're always working on. And it's something I see in their IRC channel sometimes too, is people will say a certain version of a package won't work with this or that. And basically, the best option is to file a bug.
Yeah.
Through Bugzilla. And then somebody who works on the package will actually try to work with you and fix the problem.
Yeah, I used to try that, and I knew lots of people had the exact same problem.
And it really depends on the package too.
Yeah, that's exactly the point.
Because it's up to the maintainer to make sure that the bugs get fixed, and if it's an unresponsive maintainer, you are going to get a slow service.
Yeah, I sometimes do get the impression people forget the sort of phenomenon where it's working hand in glove with things like Ubuntu, because it's assumed that lots of people will use that, and there is insufficient testing for other distributions. I felt as though in the case of Ubuntu, they get a lot of good points for things working the right way, but it's not because Ubuntu is working better. It's because lots of people test it for Ubuntu, and this very much reminded me of the situation with Windows and drivers. Lots of people say, "Oh, Linux doesn't support much hardware, or it doesn't work with the latest drivers." The truth is, it's quite different. It's the fact that the people who make the printers don't provide the code for Linux to work. So it's not really the fault of Linux. Yeah, and it felt like, I just felt like Fedora had a bit of an issue like that, where basically when they go below a certain threshold, there isn't sufficient motivation for companies or for packagers to resolve the issue for Fedora, being kind of treated as not being a very large pool of users. I don't really know to tell you the truth, this is actually an interesting thing to bring up. Do you know how many people use Fedora, or what the estimations are?
Last time I checked, there was over 20 million people using Fedora.
How is it being measured? Do you know?
I know they check downloads, they check BitTorrent, they actually check update data. They have Smolt, which you can opt into. Basically gives information about your computer so they can figure out the unique amount of people actually using it.
Yeah. When I installed Fedora on a couple of machines, I actually said no to Smolt sending the information. But I think that proves to me lots of people probably might choose to do the same type of thing, so it doesn't actually count things too accurately. One of the things I did back in December of 2010, I spent quite a bit of time on the Fedora website, and I was trying to go through the numbers of page views, the number of downloads, numbers of edits, and things like that. And it was quite interesting. I was trying to get a trends kind of worked out. I know that Fedora says it has over 20 million users, and I would like to believe that. What I actually saw that the way it's measured, it's kind of an aggregate of how many unique IP addresses they had of different releases. And I'm not sure if it's supposed to show you how many people were still using the old versions and actually counting the old versions too, as well as the existing ones. I mean, in our computer science department, one of them in Manchester, we basically have a lab with computers all of them run Fedora 11, even in 2011. And this is a case where I suppose it would count as computers running Fedora 11. Do you know how it's being counted, in fact? The way it's displayed in charts, and I think quite a few of the Windows trolls would just try to make it sound like, oh, Linux, it's less than 1% market share. They'll say things like, well, these numbers, they don't actually represent the real number of users. And I was trying to make sense of the charts or the numbering of the number of users. Maybe you can explain to me what the numbers mean?
Okay, well, they measure it differently and separate it. For Yum data, which is basically their updates, by the time April 25th had reached, we had about 2,509,399 unique IPs connecting to Yum. That's the total for Fedora 14.
Can you estimate how many people are installing Fedora perhaps in the intranet, or perhaps installing it without being connected to the internet, or not being, or actually disabling updates and things like that? I mean, the reason I ask that is because I usually assume that people who install Fedora on certain machines will do it for things like computational clusters and things like that, which don't require, if I run a computational cluster, I barely even need security patches. If they could open up the computer to the outside world, I just needed to do computations and receive the instructions locally from one machine. So you could use a firewall. You probably don't want things to break from an update you don't actually need. But and I know that quite a few of them, Fedora is one of those things that possibly is one of the unique ones in terms of support for blade servers. And I know IBM is deploying Fedora, or maybe Red Hat, on quite a few of the blade servers, and that's places where you have the very high performance computers. And so what I'm trying to say, though, is that I'm trying to make the case that I've heard before that maybe there are more Fedora users than Ubuntu users, but it's kind of like a closet situation where the Fedora users that are a bit more quiet about the presence of them. If you have a lab running Fedora clusters, if you have Fedora clusters, you probably won't be bragging about it to the same extent that some people just trying a new distribution and going around, I'm using Ubuntu and I'm using Linux, and because lots of the Fedora users tend to be more of like the veteran users, people who've used it for a while. And I don't think they make do enough advocacy of the platform, and I kind of worry that even though Fedora, which I'm a user of, is extremely widely used, people do get the impression that Linux is Ubuntu now. They don't pay attention to things like Red Hat on the server, CentOS, Scientific Linux, and so on. And I think CentOS dominates the server space in terms of numbers. Lots of web hosts are using that, but they don't talk about it because they want you to think the They want you to think that basically you're paying for Red Hat, but all they do is basically is a clone of it. And that's the thing with Fedora. I think it would be nice to know something about the methods they used to gather the numbers.